I'm Laurel Biebersdorf, strength and conditioning coach.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Court, physical therapist.
With over 30 years of combined experience in fitness, movement, and physical therapy,
we believe in strong opinions, loosely held.
Which means we're not here to hype outdated movement concepts.
Or to gatekeep or fearmonger strength training for women.
For too long, women have been sidelined in strength training.
Oh, you mean handed pink dumbbells and told to sculpt?
Whatever that means, we're here to change that with tools, evidence, and ideas that center women's needs and voices.
Let's dive in. Welcome to the Movement Logic Podcast. I'm Dr. Sarah Court. I'm a physical therapist, and I am doing today's in-betweeny episode, which means you're going to be out of here a lot more quickly than the times that Laurel is doing the in-betweeny episodes. I'm just kidding. And you know what? Don't worry. The only reason this episode might be short, I mean, frankly, who knows how long it's going to end up being, because sometimes I can get talking too. But the only reason it might be short is because the evidence is very clearly weighted, pun intended, on one side and not the other. So this episode is no lightweight. Pun intended again. Oh, these puns are terrible. Oh boy, yes, friends, today we are tackling one of those trends that is suddenly everywhere, especially in the menopause marketing space, and that is walking with a weighted vest to improve bone density. Now, I'm laughing because before we get into this episode, I want to take a moment to let you know that the fact that this was the topic for this week's In-Betweenie is, honest to God, 100% coincidental. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Laurel and I have been chatting on Instagram about a lot of the misinterpretation around the data on weighted vests here and there, but we both did a couple posts over the weekend about a video created by a, let's just say, questionable menopause specialist. And in particular, we were questioning her using a weighted vest during deadlifts and during jump band assisted chin-ups. And boy, did a lot of her supporters, I'm assuming, have a lot of feelings about that. They had a lot of feelings, especially about our tone, and that we were being mean, and that we were bashing women, and that we used to make tutorials and now we just make takedowns. Am I a rapper? Is that what just happened? I do find it interesting, and this is serious. I do find it interesting that when Laurel and I present facts about this grifter, about other grifters, the only comebacks that her supporters have are tone policing and name calling. Someone called me tweaked and jealous, which I thought was really funny. What are we in, grade school? Anyway, I will post links to both of those posts so you can see what all went down. It was really quite surprising, and a bunch of new people are now following Movement Logic, and that's very exciting, so hooray! Let's get back to the actual question at hand. Weighted vests feel like they've become just all the rage among perimenopausal and menopausal women. The claim that they build bone density really took hold in this population, and then they just were off to the races. And this makes sense to me because women with osteoporosis have historically been told, and sometimes still are told, even though it's incorrect, that walking is enough to build bone density. So the jump to walking with a weighted vest, I mean, honestly, like I kind of get how that feels logical, right? Like we're merging the walking with some weight training, which we also know we're supposed to do for our bones. So this is good, right? Right? Well, let's walk through what the research actually shows us. What's valid, what's kind of questionable, and what's actually just marketing. And then we'll get to what weighted vests can really be used for. Before we get into the episode, I do want to give a quick plug of our bone density mini course that you can get for free when you sign up for our mailing list. The mini course is a primer on everything you need to understand about lifting barbells, from correct form for the deadlift, squat, and bench press to weightlifting concepts like progressive overload and RPE. It's totally free. You can sign up at the link in the show notes or on our website or on our Instagram page. We are shoving the link in your face in every single possible place you could imagine because we want you to have the information. All right, let's get cracking. Let's start with the premise. We know that bone responds to load. A weighted vest adds load to the body. Therefore, a weighted vest must stimulate bone growth, right? That's the kind of A plus B equals C logic that's being cited for weighted vests being bone building. However, the issue is that not all loading is equal, and not all exercise, even if it's weight-bearing, reaches the load threshold necessary to stimulate bone growth or to preserve existing bone. Now, we have talked so very, very, very much about how bone remodeling takes place on this podcast, specifically in episodes, get ready, 37, 38, 51, 53, 81, 84, 91, 96, all of which I will link in the show notes. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here repeating this information, but just as a summary, bone remodeling, right? Bone growth is not triggered by just any activity. It takes a certain type and intensity of stress to get a response. Now, next season, in season 8, Laurel and I are taking a really deep dive into the current research on how different types of load may impact bone growth. But for now, it appears that low impact with high repetitions does the least amount for bone growth, if anything. And for many women, even if a weighted vest starts out feeling like a moderate load, the fact that you can hike or walk with them on tells us that it's definitely not a heavy load. So let's take a look at what the research really shows about weighted vests and their potential impact on bone metabolism and bone mineral density. And we're going to start with one of the better known long-term studies on this topic. And this one is quoted very frequently as so-called evidence that weighted vests build bone. And the study is called Long-Term Exercise Using Weighted Vests Prevents Hip Bone Loss in Postmenopausal Women. And it was done by Christine Snow et al. Out of Oregon State University in the year 2000. All of the studies cited will be in the show notes. So this was an interesting study. It was a 5-year study, which is a really long time. 18 postmenopausal women, 9 of them did jump training with weighted vests, and they did it 3 times a week, 32 weeks per year for 5 years, which is really incredible. The other half, the other 9, were generally physically active but did not do the jump training. So they got bone mineral density measurements at the femoral neck, trochanter, total hip, using a DEXA. They got baseline, and then 5 years later, they measured again. The results showed us that the jump training plus weighted vest group maintained or slightly improved their bone mineral density at each of the sites, where the control group, who were just doing what they called their regular exercise, but they weren't doing jump training, they lost over 3% of bone at each of these measured sites. Okay, so before we can get into what these results tell us, we can certainly say that this evidence really does support compliance as a requirement for exercise when it comes to having any kind of impact on bone density. It's not going to happen overnight. It's something that you're going to have to keep working on for a while. It may not take 5 years, but it's going to take more than 12 weeks, let's say. And I also wanted to just sort of a couple of quick notes about the paper, just so you get used to fine tooth combing and looking into the pros and cons of how the research paper was set up. 18 people is not a huge number. It would be great to replicate it with a larger group, which would be, from a research perspective, like the next logical step. I don't know that anyone did it. They may have, but I haven't seen it. Another thing that we should note is that the participants self-selected themselves into the exercise group or the control group, which from a bias perspective isn't great, but the fact that 80% of the exercise group remained compliant for 5 years, it's probably because they chose to be there, right? I doubt that level of compliance would have shown up if people were selected into the group that didn't really want to do it. And, it may not prove what we want it to prove, but it sure is indicating that compliance is a big deal for bone density. We are still lacking a really robust amount of research on load and impact for bone building. So while this does add to the in favor pile for impact for bone building, there are other studies out there that showed no effect from impact, but that may be more related to the degree of impact being studied, like how intense it was, right? That might have been too light. The study length might have been too short. There could be all kinds of things. Most importantly, I think, what would have been really useful is to have a third group doing the jump training, the impact training, but without a weighted vest. Because from this study, we can only say that weighted vest plus impact is better than not doing impact training with a weighted vest. If we really wanted to compare and see if the weighted vest itself made any difference, we would need 3 groups, right? We would want a group that is weighted vest plus impact. We want another group that's doing impact but no weighted vest. And we want a third group that's not doing impact. We can't say for sure what the weighted vest did, but regardless, here's the really important thing. These people were not walking with the weighted vest on. They were jumping repeatedly for 5 years. This was a really well-structured, high-impact, high-consistency program. This is not a stroll around the neighborhood with a weight on your chest and your favorite podcast, this one, in your ears. So we're talking kind of apples and oranges here, right? You can't look at this study and say, and extrapolate that this must mean that if I take a walk with a weighted vest on, even if I'm doing incline walking, that is going to build bone density. You just can't. Right? There's no evidence to prove that. And yet this study is the one that's very often cited as proof of the efficacy of weighted vests, not proof of the efficacy of jump training, which is really the only thing that it can prove. Now, this is a bit of an aside, but the exercise protocol that these authors used in this study was actually the same as one that they did in 1998, where they looked at how wearing a weighted vest for women who have never participated in resistance training impacted their balance, strength, and power over 9 months. What was interesting was that they found that all of these qualities were improved, but bone density was not, even though it was a 9-month period, which really should have been sufficient time to show any bone density changes. And they were doing progressive overload with the vest. They were making it heavier over time. They were doing exercises. They weren't walking, right? And it still wasn't enough. So it doesn't seem likely, based on this work, that walking with a weighted vest would really do anything for your bone density. What this study does tell us is it lines up with what we already know about impact training and its role in bone adaptation, right? Bone cells really respond to high strain rates, right? That means faster force, and novel or multi-directional movements like hopping, dodging, jumping, not walking in a straight line. Jumping with a weighted vest provides high rate loading, but so does jumping without a weighted vest. Weighted vests may be helpful to build bone and impact exercise. Again, we cannot say that for sure. Just to summarize, this study did not test impact without the vest, so we really cannot draw a weighted vest specific conclusion. Okay, so the next study that I wanted to look at is looking at bone turnover markers, not bone mineral density. The study is called A Comparison Between the Effects of the Walking Exercise with and Without Weighted Vests. I'm going to absolutely murder this name. I apologize. Tantiwibunchai, I believe is how you would pronounce it, et al. From 2011. This study took place in Thailand, and it looked at 48 participants that were split into 2 groups. One group walked with a weighted vest that gradually increased to 8% of their body weight. The other walked without a vest. Both groups walked 30 minutes 3 times a week on a treadmill at 65 to 75% of their max heart rate. So a decent pace, but they're certainly not, by no means are they running. Okay. And they measured something called bone turnover markers, which you may have heard some about. These are markers that show up in a blood test. There are several of these types of markers, and they can tell us if there is bone resorption going on and or bone formation going on, right? Different markers show different things. Real quick, I just want to chat about the difference between studies that are using a DEXA scan that shows bone mineral density versus studies that are using bone turnover markers, BTMs, for bone. This conversation could stand to be an episode on its own, and I may well do one on it in the future. But just a real quick sort of comparison. So the DEXA scan at the moment is the gold standard for measuring bone density. But the changes that take place in your bone density take a long time to show up, at least 6, maybe 8, 9 months, right? But it is a very good fracture predictor, and it's a really good diagnostic tool for osteoporosis and osteopenia, and it's the one that people use out in the world when they're trying to see, are you at risk for developing osteoporosis? They're more likely to do a DEXA scan to see what your bone density looks like right now than to test your blood and see like what are the markers up to, because the markers aren't telling you any information about the quantity of bone. They're just saying resorption is happening, formation is happening, right? So in comparison to bone turnover markers, as I said, they show us what's going on with bone formation and resorption, and you can see the changes pretty quickly, right? This study was a 12-week study, and they did see changes in the BTMs, but there can be a lot of variability in the results. So the results are not always as accurate as they could be. They don't predict what bone mineral density someone might have, and they cannot and are not used for either prognosis or diagnosis of osteoporosis or osteopenia. So here's what's interesting. Both the walking group with the vest and the walking group without the vest had a significant reduction in bone resorption markers, but there was no statistically significant difference between the vest group and the no vest group, and there was no significant change in the bone formation markers in either group. So the walking with a vest or without a vest reduced the amount of bone resorption markers in the blood, and so therefore that suggests that it reduced bone resorption. It stopped people's bones from breaking down as quickly, but it didn't build any bone. There were no markers for bone formation. And the vest in and of itself didn't show any difference in the decrease in bone resorption, right? They didn't get better results with the vest versus without the vest. 12 weeks is not enough time to measure bone mineral density changes, and it does appear very robustly that bone building exercise requires longer time under load than a 12-week period. So the walking itself reduced bone breakdown by a certain amount, but the vest didn't make any difference in particular. So yes, walking has health benefits, but again, the vest does not transform it into a bone building activity.
You've heard that strength training is great for bone density, but where do you even start?
The Bone Density Mini Course, Barbell 101, is a free, no-nonsense introduction to lifting heavy with confidence. You'll learn exactly how to set up and use barbells, racks, and plates without second-guessing yourself. We'll walk you through the squat, bench press, and deadlift, and show you how to avoid the most common mistakes that can hold you back when you're just starting out.
Maybe you're wondering, how do I even set up a barbell at the right height for my body before I start lifting?
What's the difference between a squat and a deadlift, and how does that impact the muscles I'm training?
Why focus on a 5-rep max lift instead of higher reps?
How long should I rest between sets, and why is that rest so important for lifting heavy?
What exactly is rate of perceived exertion, and how can it help me pick the right weight every time?
How do I warm up for and build up to lifting a heavy weight safely?
If you've ever had these questions, or if you're not sure of the answers, This course will walk you through everything step by step so you can start lifting with confidence. Did we mention that it's free?
Strength training doesn't have to be overwhelming. It just takes the right guidance.
Get the free course now via the link in the show notes and start getting strong AF.
All right, so the last study I want to look at is a pretty short study, but it's interesting. This one is looking at postmenopausal women with diagnosed osteoporosis. It's called Effects of Short-Term Aerobic Exercise with and Without External Loading on Bone Metabolism and Balance in Postmenopausal Women with Osteoporosis. And it's from 2012 by Rogani et al. So this study had 36 women. They were split into 3 groups. One walked on a treadmill without a vest. One walked on a treadmill with a vest, and the vest started at 4 p.m. The vest started at 4% of body weight and increased to 8%. And one group didn't exercise at all. So they trained 3 times per week for 6 weeks. And the researchers looked at bone turnover markers, body composition, and balance. So we know that they couldn't use a DEXA scan because 6 weeks is not anywhere near long enough for any actual bone building to show up on a DEXA scan. So again, they're looking at these bone turnover markers that show up to indicate that there is this activity going on. So the balance tests, this is the interesting part. So they use 2 balance tests. One is called the near tandem stand, and the other one is called the star excursion test. These are tests we use in PT to evaluate someone's balance. So the near tandem stance test, and sometimes it's called the 10-second tandem stance test. That's not easy to say. It goes like this. You stand with one foot in front of the other, like heel to toe touching. And then you close your eyes and you stand there. And hopefully you are able to stand there for that full 10 seconds. If you lose your balance in less than 10 seconds, it can indicate that your static balance is in some way compromised. The star excursion test, although it might sound like it, it is not an all expenses paid trip to Hollywood. No, it is another balance test, but this time it's testing your dynamic balance. So the way it works is there'll be 3 lines marked on the floor that all intersect in one middle spot, right? So they make this quote unquote star shape, right? So you stand in the center of the star, you keep one foot in the center, and then you reach your other leg as far as you can along each of the legs of the star. So forwards, diagonally backwards to one side, diagonally backwards to the other. And then they measure how far you could reach each leg, and they compare it to the normative values to then determine your dynamic balance capability. It's also actually, as a side note, it's a really good test for seeing if your balance is better on one leg than the other. If one leg than the other is stronger in certain ways, it's kind of a real good test of symmetry, just as an aside. Okay, so here's what's interesting. Both exercise groups showed positive changes in the bone metabolism markers without any difference between the vest and the no vest group, which lines up with what we saw before, right, in the study previous. But here's what's really interesting. The vest group significantly outperformed both other groups in the balance measures. Their near tandem stand score improved by over 100%. They improved in every direction of the star excursion balance test, while the control group, their balance actually got worse over the 6-week period. Now, we know that 6 weeks is not a long enough time to stimulate bone growth, but it was long enough to improve balance markers significantly. Now, could we extrapolate that bone growth would occur if they did it for a longer period? No, we can't make that assumption. Even though we saw positive changes in the bone metabolism markers, we cannot make any assumption about what bone mineral density will do. Well, here's what's interesting. Wearing a weighted vest while walking helped significantly with balance, which is really important for people who are at a risk of falls or fractures. This is also, the weighted vest is not the magic tool. It's the weight part. So very likely, had the people been holding 2 dumbbells in their hands, I mean, I can't say this for sure, but it's the weight part of the weighted vest. It's not the vest part that matters, right? Working with resistance, something that is going to help build some strength, it confers improved balance because of your increased strength, because muscles around your trunk and hip get stronger from walking with a load, right? Now, that is true for this group of postmenopausal women who have diagnosed osteoporosis. They had certain exclusion criteria. Oh, here we go. So the people that they recruited had no record of regular exercise for at least 1 year and had a T-score that indicated osteoporosis. So the fact that they got stronger from walking with a weighted vest has a lot to do with the fact that they were sedentary, that were probably pretty deconditioned, possibly afraid of exercise, right? Because that's what a lot of people with osteoporosis find happens. So the fact that the weighted vest made them stronger, we can't say that weighted vests are going to make everybody stronger, right? That we can't even say weighted vests are going to make postmenopausal women stronger, but it did make a dent in strength for these women who were specifically recruited because they were sedentary and because they had not done any regular exercise for at least a year. All right. So where does this leave us in the weighted vest debate? Well, here's what we can say. So if you're walking while wearing a weighted vest, you might get a slight increase in your cardiovascular endurance. You might see some improvements in your balance and muscular endurance. Well, hold for Victor. If you haven't heard this before, Victor is my 100-year-old landlord. He lives directly upstairs. I think he wears like dress shoes every single day. I mean, that man can really get around. He's not a slow walker. Okay, so weighted vest while walking, you might help slow down bone loss a little bit, particularly if you are deconditioned or frail. But if you are neither of those things, it's very unlikely that it's going to make any sort of a dent in your bone density. If you want to build new bone, if you want to increase bone mineral density at critical sites like your hip and your spine, or if you want to actually attempt to reverse your osteoporosis, assuming it responds to the best evidence out there, which is resistance and impact, you're not going to get any of those things happening in a light vest and a brisk walk. You need more load. You need more impact. Bottom line, your bones need more stress. And so that means progressively overloaded resistance training. It doesn't matter how heavy it is as long as you are continuing to make it heavier based on a program that is appropriate for you. Jump training, also if appropriate for you, but hugely valuable. That's something that your bones are actually going to respond to. Okay, so here's the part where we do an asterisk. And this asterisk is called, but some people could actually really use a weighted vest. What about them? And yes, absolutely. There are probably a lot more examples of what this would be, but here's a few. For example, someone who has maybe severe arthritis in their hands, who would have difficulty holding weights with their hands, right? You could put on a weighted vest and do your squats or lunges or anything like that. Someone else that might benefit from it is someone who is like really deconditioned and who could only actually hold a relatively light dumbbell because of their decreased grip strength. You could use a weighted vest to help with the progressive overload for their weight training that way, right? Or let's say you're doing an aerobic exercise like walking or hiking, and you actually want to increase the cardio effect and bring your heart rate up. A weighted vest can help, but you're going to run into a problem where as you get accustomed to the weight of the vest, you're going to have to keep increasing it as your cardiac capacity improves. Now, I think people might be surprised to hear this, but I actually do. I wear a weighted vest but only in one very specific circumstance, and that is when I go on a hike with my dog. His name is Henry, and this is because Henry's little legs they're little. Listen, let's not beat around the bush. He's got little legs. And he also likes to sniff things because he's very close to the ground because his legs are so little. So an uphill hike that I would be doing without him, where I'd just be like charging up the hill, that would get my heart rate up, right? But when I'm with him, it's stop, start, smell, say hi to this dog, it doesn't do it. And I don't have a large menu of cardio exercise that I really enjoy enough to do. So this is hiking is really one of the few things that I am on board with. So I appreciate the help of the weighted vest so that I can get my heart rate into at least zone 2. My weighted vest has little like pouches of weight that you can take in and out, and I've had to like keep adding them in, and I think pretty soon I'm gonna like top out at the maximum amount of weight that I can add to this vest, and then I'm gonna have to see what happens. I'm not interested in owning a collection of heavier and heavier weighted vests, so I might have to just stop considering my hikes with Henry as any part of my exercise and more about practicing being present and stopping to sniff the flowers. And I was going to say, and the buttholes, but that's him. I don't need to do that. Okay. I hope this helps you better understand the value and use of a weighted vest, what it can and cannot do for you, and whether it's an appropriate tool to add to your cupboard full of tools, and whether it's an appropriate tool for you. The TLDR is that it's really unlikely to do anything meaningful for your bone density unless you're using it in a way that we already know improves bone density, right? So with impact or as part of a progressively overloaded resistance training that is more likely moderate and even heavy loads, less likely to be useful if it's just a low load. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Please don't forget to rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This is a topic that people seem very confused about. So if you and your friends or your neighbor or your mom have been talking about whether or not you should get a weighted vest, send them the link to this episode. Let them take a listen to the evidence that's out there, and then you can make a evidence-based decision rather than being convinced by somebody on the internet who is just making money. I do not sell a weighted vest. I got no money in weighted vests, so I got nothing on this argument. Okay. And like I said, if you sign up for the Movement Logic mailing list, which you will be able to do at the link in the show notes and all over the place, we will send you our free course. It is a simple, evidence-informed guide to get you started with lifting barbells safely, confidently, and effectively, even if you've never lifted before. And even if you're not actually using barbells, it's just going to show you the form and the alignment. You can always replace with dumbbells, kettlebells, whatever you had. I mean, frankly, if the heaviest thing you own is a weighted vest and it still feels heavy to you, I mean, you could slap on your weighted vest and do your squats. It's going to depend on how heavy it is and whether that makes much difference to you and your body, but certainly for building a little bit of strength, it might be useful. Okay, that's it from me. Weighted vests are not the devil, but they might not be doing what you think they're doing. We will see you in 2 weeks.